On the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of July, 1993, a nurse named Sharon Dempsey was making her way down a long hallway at the Mahiri Hubbard Hospital in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. She moved with a purpose, her steps quick and efficient as she checked in on her patients. But on this particular morning, she was also on a mission. She was searching for one patient who had a habit of wandering away from her room. As Sharon reached the end of the hallway, she peered into the last room and let out a small sigh of relief. There, inside, was the woman she had been looking for. Her name was Mildred Lancaster. She was 69 years old, and at that moment, she was busy sweeping the floor of another patient's room. She was using a broom that Sharon recognized immediately, one that Mildred had likely swiped from a custodian's cart she'd found in the hallway. Sharon walked into the room and gently approached the older woman. She asked her, "Mildred, what are you doing here?" Mildred turned, a look of simple purpose on her face, and she replied that she was just doing her job. But of course, this wasn't her job. Mildred wasn't an employee of the hospital. She was a patient. She had been admitted just 2 days earlier, suffering from severe stomach pain. But that wasn't her only issue. Mildred also experienced extreme bouts of confusion, which was exactly what Sharon was witnessing right now. The nurse had to hide a small, weary smile. This had become a familiar routine. Mildred's family had explained her history to the hospital staff when she was admitted. For most of her life, Mildred had worked as a housekeeper. It was a job she took pride in, a role that had defined her for decades. And so now, when her mind would get clouded with confusion, she would often revert back to that familiar identity. She would think she was at work, even when she was at home, or in this case, in a hospital bed. Her family had seen it many times. She would suddenly get up and start tidying things, convinced she was on the clock. Because of this behavior, the hospital staff had considered using physical restraints to keep Mildred safely in her room. The fear was that she might wander into a restricted area or hurt herself. But Mildred was such a sweet and gentle soul. The idea of tying her down just felt wrong to everyone involved. So, the medical team decided on a different approach. They would have to accept that from time to time, Mildred was going to believe she was a housekeeper again. She would likely leave her room and go looking for something to clean. The plan was simple. Keep a very close eye on her, make sure she was safe, and continue to treat her stomach pain while managing her disorientation. So, in this moment, finding Mildred with a broom in her hand, Sharon just followed that protocol. She spoke to her in a calm, gentle voice and said, "Okay, Mildred, you can put the broom down now. Come with me." Mildred, ever agreeable, listened. She set the broom against the wall, and Sharon gently led her by the arm, walking her back down the hall to her own room. After making sure Mildred was settled, Sharon continued with her rounds, the small incident already fading from her mind. A couple of days went by. Sharon was once again doing her regular rounds, moving from room to room, checking charts, and speaking with patients. When she arrived at Mildred's room, she pushed the door open and saw that it was empty. The bed was neatly made, but Mildred was nowhere in sight. At first, Sharon just felt a wave of annoyance. By this point, Mildred had wandered off so many times that it was becoming a bit of a hassle. It wasn't alarming anymore, just another small task to add to her already busy day. Sharon followed the usual procedure. She left the room and began walking the floor, checking other patient rooms, utility closets, and common areas, expecting to find Mildred tidying up some corner of the hospital. But this time was different. After a full sweep of the entire floor, there was no sign of her. Sharon went back and started her search again, this time being much more thorough. She looked in every supply closet, every empty room, every nook and cranny she could think of. Still nothing. That's when the annoyance started to curdle into real concern, a knot of panic tightening in her stomach. She started approaching other nurses and doctors, her voice a little more urgent now. She asked them, "Have you seen Mildred Lancaster?" By now, most of the staff on the floor knew about Mildred and her habit of wandering, but no one had seen her. Not a single person. Realizing this was now a serious situation, Sharon went to her superiors and informed them that one of her patients was missing. Immediately, the hospital launched a full-scale search. Security personnel and staff members fanned out across the entire building, a sprawling 11-story complex. They searched inside and out, checking every floor, every wing, every possible hiding place. Sharon tried to help, walking around and telling the search teams where Mildred might be likely to go. She told them to focus on areas that looked messy or disorganized. She explained that when Mildred got confused, her instinct was to find clutter and clean it up. So people started checking storage rooms, renovation areas, and anywhere else that might have looked untidy to Mildred. But the hospital was massive. There were countless messy areas, and the task of searching them all felt overwhelming. To make matters worse, the hospital had no security cameras. They couldn't just rewind some footage to see if Mildred had walked out one of the doors. There was no digital trail to follow. After an hour of frantic searching, they had found nothing. The hope of finding her quickly was beginning to fade, and people started to wonder if they would find her at all. It was at this point that the situation took a strange and concerning new turn. As part of her duty, Sharon called Mildred's cousin to let the family know what was happening. She explained that Mildred was missing, and that this time, it was serious. But as Sharon was breaking the news, the cousin stopped her. She said, "Wait a minute. I think I know what's going on." It turned out that a few hours earlier, the cousin had actually come to the hospital to visit Mildred. When she arrived and spoke to the receptionist at the front desk, she asked for Mildred's room number. The receptionist looked up the name in the system and then gave the cousin some surprising news. The computer showed that Mildred Lancaster had been officially checked out of the hospital that very morning. This new information completely changed the situation. The massive search was pointless if Mildred wasn't even in the building. But to Sharon, it made absolutely no sense. Mildred was in no condition to be discharged. She was still sick, still suffering from stomach pain, and her confusion was as bad as ever. There was no way a doctor would have signed off on her release. Yet, the cousin was certain. The receptionist had told her Mildred was gone, so the cousin had turned around and left without ever going upstairs. Sharon hung up the phone, her mind racing. She quickly walked down to the main lobby to talk to the receptionist herself. She asked the woman to look up Mildred's file, and sure enough, the system confirmed it. Mildred Lancaster had been discharged. Sharon stood there, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this have happened? Who would have authorized it? Not knowing what to do next, she walked away from the desk and went over to a large window that overlooked the busy streets in front of the hospital. She just stood there, watching the cars speed by, trying to process this bizarre turn of events. And then, a horrible thought entered her mind. What if Mildred, in her confused state, had somehow managed to wander down to the front desk and convince someone to discharge her? What if she had then walked out the front doors and was now wandering aimlessly through the city? She could have been hit by a car. She could be hurt, lying somewhere, unable to call for help. The situation had suddenly become a true emergency. Sharon knew what she had to do. She had to call the police. Not long after, police officers arrived at the hospital and they brought search dogs with them. Almost immediately, one of the dogs picked up Mildred's scent right by one of the main front doors. The dog then led its handler down the sidewalk and along the street, which seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Mildred really had left the hospital and wandered off. The police launched a massive search of the surrounding area. Officers canvassed a full square mile around the hospital, and a helicopter was brought in to scan the area from above. The search for Mildred went on for days, but it was fruitless. There was no sign of her anywhere. She had vanished without a trace. Then, almost 2 weeks later, the search came to a tragic end. On Wednesday, July 28th, 13 days after Mildred had disappeared, a security guard was doing his daily patrol through a construction site. As he walked along the edge of the site, he noticed a long, thin hole in the ground. It was about 5 feet deep, a trench that had been dug to lay some new pipework. The guard probably wouldn't have given it a second thought, but for some reason, he decided to walk over and look down into it. As he peered into the darkness, he gasped. Down at the bottom of the trench, he saw Mildred. It turns out, on the day she disappeared, Mildred had indeed become confused. She believed she was a housekeeper again, and she had left her room to go find some work to do. She began wandering through the hospital, moving from floor to floor. Surprisingly, nobody stopped her. She was such a pleasant and gentle woman that people who saw her probably just smiled and assumed she knew where she was going. After wandering for quite a while, going up and down different flights of stairs, she eventually found her way to the construction site. But to her confused mind, it wasn't a construction site. It was just a terribly messy area that was in desperate need of a good cleaning. There were pieces of wood, scraps of plastic, and debris scattered everywhere. So, Mildred got to work. She spent some time tidying the area, picking up debris, and trying to make things orderly. As she worked her way towards the back of the site, she failed to see the deep, narrow trench in the ground. She took a step and fell inside. Because she was so disoriented, she likely didn't even understand what had happened. She wouldn't have realized she had fallen into a hole and needed to climb out. In that dark, confined space, her confusion would have only deepened. She may not have even tried to escape. And so, she remained in that hole, undetected, for 13 days, until she eventually passed away. But perhaps the most tragic part of this entire story is that Mildred had never actually left the hospital. The construction site where she was found was located on the 10th floor of the hospital. That entire floor was being renovated, and she had simply meandered her way up there. All of those search parties, all of those police officers, they had all been looking for her outside. Even the teams that searched inside the hospital had been to that construction site. They had walked right past the very hole where she was lying. But they hadn't thought to look down into it. And Mildred, assuming she was still alive when they were nearby, was too confused and disoriented to call out for help. She just stayed quiet in that hole, and so she was never found in time. To this day, it's still not known why her hospital records showed that she had been discharged. Some believe it was a simple clerical error, a mistaken entry in the system. Others think it might have been a computer glitch. And the police dog that picked up her scent and led the search away from the hospital, that also remains an unexplained anomaly. Mildred's family later sued the hospital for $13 million in damages, but for reasons that were never made public, they eventually dropped the case. On the night of the 12th of January 1964, a police sergeant named Neil Johnson stepped into a small apartment in Los Angeles County, California. He was followed by a team of other officers, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, they were hit by two things at once: a blast of intense dry heat and a truly terrible smell. It was the smell of decomposition, and it didn't take them long to find the source. There, on the living room couch, was the body of a man. He was clearly deceased and had been for some time. Sergeant Johnson and his team had been called to the apartment by the building's landlord. Other tenants had been complaining for days about a foul odor coming from this specific unit, and the landlord had finally called the police to investigate. Based on the information the landlord had already provided, the police had a good idea of who the man on the couch was. The apartment was rented to a 8-year-old man named Eugene Meadows. Eugene was new to the building. In fact, he had only moved in 6 days earlier. He was also new to the area, having relocated from about 8 hours away to start a new job. This meant it was very likely he didn't know many people in town yet. Sergeant Johnson and a few other officers moved closer to the couch to get a better look at the body. Right away, two things became apparent. First, it was clear that Eugene had not died recently. Based on the state of his body, he had probably been dead for at least a couple of days. And second, there was a very distinct hole in the back of his head. It looked for all the world like a bullet wound. But as Sergeant Johnson began to survey the rest of the apartment, he realized that the bullet hole didn't make any sense. For starters, the entire apartment was incredibly neat and clean. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of a robbery or a break-in. Everything was in its place. The landlord had also told the police something crucial. When he had first come to check on the apartment after the smell complaints, he had found the front door locked from the inside. He also checked and found that all of the windows were closed and securely locked as well. This presented a major problem for the murder theory. If Eugene had been shot, the killer would have had to lock the door from the outside as they left. This would mean they had a key. It was possible they took it from Eugene, but given that he was so new to the area, it seemed unlikely he had given a key to anyone. The alternative theory, that Eugene had taken his own life, seemed even less plausible. The biggest problem with that idea was the complete absence of a gun. If he had shot himself, the weapon should have been somewhere nearby, on the couch, or on the floor next to him. But it wasn't. The officers conducted a thorough search of the entire apartment, looking in every drawer, closet, and cabinet. There was no gun to be found. Sergeant Johnson and his team were completely baffled. It was a classic locked room mystery. The scene didn't point to murder, and it didn't point to suicide. It just didn't make any sense at all. Rather than speculate further at the scene, they had Eugene's body transported to the local coroner's office for an autopsy. They hoped that a medical examination would provide the answers they so desperately needed. However, when the coroner examined Eugene's body, the case only became stranger. The first and most shocking discovery was that the coroner could not find a bullet anywhere inside of Eugene's head or his body. There was also no exit wound. Typically, when someone is shot, the bullet either remains lodged inside the body or it passes all the way through, creating a second hole. Eugene had one hole in the back of his head, no exit wound, and absolutely no bullet. It was a physical impossibility. In addition to this major anomaly, the coroner noted two other strange details. The first was that Eugene had something called a calcium ridge on the back of his skull near the location of the hole. This is a harmless genetic trait, where a small section of the skull is harder but also more brittle than the surrounding bone. It was something he would have been born with and likely never knew he had. But given its proximity to the wound, the coroner made a special note of it. The second strange finding was the color of Eugene's internal organs. When the coroner examined his abdomen, he saw that the organs were a bright, vibrant cherry red. At first, the coroner wasn't sure if this was significant. It was unusual, but it didn't immediately point to a cause of death. But as he continued to puzzle over the case, unable to make sense of how Eugene had died or how he got the hole in his head, his mind kept coming back to those red organs. Suddenly, he had an idea, a theory that was wild but might just explain everything. He contacted the police and asked Sergeant Johnson to go back to Eugene's apartment and check for one very specific thing. He told him that if it was there, the entire mystery would be solved. Sure enough, Sergeant Johnson and his team returned to the apartment. They followed the coroner's instructions, and they found exactly what he had suspected would be there. And just like he'd said, it explained everything. It turned out that what happened to Eugene was not a murder, nor was it a suicide. In fact, there had been no shooting at all. The coroner's suspicion, sparked by the sight of those bright red organs, was that Eugene had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. This type of poisoning is known to cause a victim's internal organs to turn that distinctive cherry red color. When the police went back to the apartment, they discovered that the building's heater was old and faulty. It was leaking, and it had been slowly filling Eugene's small, sealed apartment with poisonous carbon monoxide gas. The mystery of how Eugene died was finally solved. But that still left the question of the hole in his head. The explanation for that was even more bizarre. After Eugene had passed out on his couch from the gas, the carbon monoxide continued to build up in his system. One of the effects of severe poisoning is that it can cause the brain to swell dramatically. As Eugene's brain began to expand inside his skull, it pushed against the bone. And because he had that unique calcium ridge on the back of his head, that area of his skull that was harder but also more brittle, the pressure had to go somewhere. As his brain continued to swell, the immense pressure eventually caused that brittle section of his skull to shatter. His brain essentially blew out a small portion of the back of his head, creating a wound that looked exactly like a gunshot hole to the naked eye. It was a tragic, one-in-a-million accident that had created the illusion of a violent crime. One afternoon in the spring of 1998, a 64-year-old man named Klaus Schmidt was walking through the international terminal of the Dublin airport in Ireland. As he made his way through the bustling crowds, he was gripped by a powerful and unsettling feeling of nervousness. He couldn't shake the idea that getting on his flight that day was a very, very bad idea. When he finally spotted his gate at the far end of the terminal, that vague nervousness intensified into a sense of genuine dread that washed over him completely. Now, Klaus was generally an anxious flyer. He never enjoyed the experience, but this was different. He had never felt this kind of deep existential fear before boarding a plane. This was a new and terrifying feeling. When he reached his gate, he saw the other passengers lining up, showing their tickets, and walking down the jet bridge. The sight of them boarding the plane almost triggered a full-blown panic attack. He stood, frozen for a moment, his mind screaming at him to turn around. A voice in his head told him to just listen to his gut, to not get on this plane. He could just go back to the ticket counter, book a flight for the next day, and this horrible feeling would go away. But as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, the logical side of his brain began to fight back. He told himself that he was just being ridiculous. He was a nervous flyer, and his anxiety was getting the better of him. There was nothing to be worried about. The flight would be short, and it would be over before he knew it. He was just overreacting. So, even though he couldn't completely shake the feeling of dread that was now a tight knot in his stomach, he decided to override his instincts. He took a deep breath, walked up to the gate, had his ticket scanned, and forced himself to board the flight. About an hour later, the plane had taken off and was cruising high above the Irish Sea. Klaus was in a window seat. He cautiously raised the plastic shade and looked out. The sky was clear, the water below was calm and beautiful. He glanced around the cabin at the other passengers. People were reading, chatting quietly, or dozing. Everyone seemed perfectly relaxed. There was absolutely no reason to think anything was wrong. But still, Klaus could not get rid of that awful feeling. He just wanted the plane to land, for this whole ordeal to be over. He knew he couldn't make the plane go any faster, so he tried to do some breathing exercises to calm his racing heart. He breathed in slowly, held it, and then breathed out. At first, it seemed to be working. His anxiety began to ebb just a little. But over the next 10 or 15 minutes, something new started to happen. Klaus started to feel like he was having a hard time breathing. It felt as if the air was getting thin. He discreetly looked around the cabin again, trying to see if anyone else was struggling, if maybe there was a problem with the cabin pressure. But everyone else still looked completely fine. It was just him. The difficulty breathing grew worse, and he started to sweat. He was rocking back and forth in his seat now, consumed by an anxiety he couldn't control. Then, a new symptom appeared. He started to feel an intense tightness in his chest, a crushing pressure that was both painful and terrifying. His first thought was that he was having the worst panic attack of his life. His anxiety had finally spiraled completely out of control. He fumbled to take off his jacket, unbuttoning the top of his shirt, hoping to get some relief. He was now dripping with sweat, and the passengers sitting near him were starting to notice. They were giving him concerned looks, but no one had said anything yet. Klaus tried to tell himself to stay calm, but it was impossible. The tightness in his chest got so bad, so intense, that he realized this probably wasn't just anxiety. This felt like something much more serious. This felt like a heart attack. The moment that realization hit him, it was as if all of his symptoms became 10 times worse. The pain in his chest was unbearable, and he felt his consciousness begin to fade. The world around him started to go dim. He could hear the muffled sounds of other passengers near him yelling for help. He heard a flight attendant rush over and her voice calling out urgently to the rest of the plane, asking if there were any doctors on board. As Klaus drifted further and further into unconsciousness, his last coherent thought was that his intuition had been right all along. Something terrible was going to happen to him on this plane. And before he could think anything more, his vision went completely blurry and he faded into total darkness. But it would turn out that Klaus's powerful intuition was actually only half right. While it was true that something terrible did happen to him on that flight, he really did suffer a massive heart attack. It was his decision to ignore that intuition and get on the plane that actually saved his life. Because this particular flight, by an incredible stroke of luck, was carrying 40 of the world's leading heart specialists. They were all flying home from an international cardiology conference. And it gets even more unbelievable. They just happened to be carrying samples with them of a brand new experimental heart drug, one that was not yet available to the general public. So when Klaus collapsed and the flight attendant called out for a doctor, not one but 40 doctors all raised their hands. One of them rushed over to Klaus's side, quickly diagnosed the heart attack, and immediately administered the new life-saving medication. Against all odds, the very flight he was terrified to board was the only place on Earth that could have saved him at that exact moment. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly, they started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling, not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So, the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house, and they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. "I'm back. Find me if you can." It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, "I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay." He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him. But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So, they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house, and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. He was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neri Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a remote and dusty desert in South Australia. This vast, barren area was called Maralinga. Neri and his brothers belonged to an isolated Aboriginal tribe known as the Martu people. On this particular day, the boys were out doing what their people had done for generations. They were hunting for food to bring back to their family. Specifically, they were tracking kangaroos. Neri, being the oldest, carried a hunting spear, while his two younger brothers carried a wooden club and a traditional boomerang. For hours, they had been quietly following a specific group of kangaroos across the dry terrain. But every single time the boys got close, just as they would slow down and prepare to strike, the kangaroos would suddenly sense them and bolt away. It was incredibly frustrating, and the afternoon sun was starting to beat down on them. But they kept going because their family was relying on them for dinner. Eventually, as they continued their long trek, the kangaroos stopped. They had gathered around a small watering hole just a few dozen yards away from where the brothers were hiding. Neri looked at his brothers and knew this was their absolute best chance. The kangaroos were thirsty, and they were going to stay at that watering hole long enough for the boys to make their move. Neri quietly signaled to his younger brothers that it was time to advance. They dropped low into the dry brush, moving as silently as possible, inching closer and closer to their targets. But after taking only a few cautious steps, a strange and terrifying sound shattered the quiet of the desert. It started as a low, deep, rumbling noise vibrating through the ground from somewhere off in the distance. The brothers stopped in their tracks. Before they could even understand what was happening, the entire sky suddenly lit up. It was an impossibly bright, blinding white light, so intense that Neri had to quickly shield his eyes with his arms just to keep from being blinded. And as he was doing this, a massive, incredibly hot gust of wind came roaring through the desert. This was not a normal desert breeze. It was a violent shockwave that blasted right into them, literally lifting the brothers off their feet and slamming them hard onto the dirt. They lay there, completely disoriented, with their ears ringing and their skin burning from the sudden heat. From the ground, Neri struggled to turn his head to see what had happened to his brothers and the environment around them. He looked over in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos had been just moments before. And what he saw next made absolutely no sense to him. The kangaroos were literally floating high up in the air, drifting right toward them through the hazy sky, and then they suddenly dropped heavily onto the ground. A moment later, it was as if a switch had been flipped. Everything just went back to normal. The blinding white light faded, and the sky returned to its usual blue color. The deep rumbling stopped, and the hot wind died down completely. The desert was quiet once again. Except now, right in front of Neri and his brothers, lay a dozen dead kangaroos. The boys stood up, dusted the dirt off their clothes, and tried to process what they had just witnessed. They had absolutely no concept of modern technology or what could cause such a massive explosion. To them, living their isolated life, there was only one logical explanation. They looked at this incredible bounty of fresh meat lying right at their feet, and they decided this must have been a gift from God. They believed that God had literally reached down, taken the lives of these kangaroos, lifted them up, and delivered them directly to the brothers so their tribe wouldn't go hungry. Filled with gratitude, Neri and his brothers began lifting the heavy animals, carrying as many of the dead kangaroos as they possibly could manage back to their camp. When they arrived and told their people what had happened, the tribe was overjoyed. That very night, they held a massive celebration to honor this miraculous gift from God. They built a large fire, roasted the kangaroo meat, and held a giant feast. Almost everyone in the tribe ate the meat, celebrating their good fortune. But the very next morning, the celebration turned into a nightmare. When the tribe woke up, nearly everyone who had eaten the kangaroo meat was violently ill. People were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies were covered in painful red rashes, and they were suffering from intense aches and deep internal pain. Over the next few days, some of the tribe members slowly began to recover, but many others only got worse. Soon, people from the tribe began to die, one after the other. Neri and the surviving members of the tribe immediately made the connection. They realized that whatever was killing their people was directly tied to the kangaroo meat they had eaten. Some members of the tribe who had been skeptical about the gift from God theory argued that the meat must have been poisoned. But they had no idea how it had been poisoned, or if someone had done it on purpose. For Neri and his people, this tragic event remained an unsolved mystery for over a decade. Fast forward to 11 years later, in 1967, when Neri was 24 years old. That was when representatives from the British government finally arrived in the remote areas of southern Australia near where the Martu tribe lived. It turned out these officials were there to try and clean up a massive, dangerous mess they had created years earlier. And that was when the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Those dead kangaroos that had seemingly floated through the air and dropped at the feet of Neri and his brothers were not a gift from God at all. Instead, they were the victims of a highly classified, top-secret scientific experiment. The British government had been using the Maralinga Desert to test active nuclear weapons. On that afternoon in 1956, Neri and his brothers had been standing just a few kilometers away from an active nuclear detonation site. Where they were positioned was the absolute perfect spot to experience the fringe effects of a nuclear blast. They saw the blinding flash of the detonation, they heard the deafening roar of the shockwave, and they felt the intense thermal radiation that knocked them to the ground. But because they were just far enough away, the blast wave did not kill them. It only disoriented and bruised them. However, the kangaroos at the watering hole were positioned slightly closer to the epicenter of the bomb. Because the kangaroos were closer, and because they were much smaller animals, they were completely vulnerable to the full force of the pressure wave. The shock wave had killed the kangaroos instantly, lifted them into the air, and thrown their bodies forward, landing them right in front of the boys. But the worst part was that the blast had coated the animal carcasses in highly concentrated, invisible radioactive fallout. When the tribe cooked and ate the meat, they were ingesting lethal amounts of radiation. This caused severe acute radiation sickness, which explained the sudden vomiting, the skin rashes, and the agonizing deaths. The British government kept these tests secret for years, and an unknown number of indigenous people lost their lives due to the radioactive contamination. Eventually, after the truth came out, the Australian government ended up paying $13.5 million in compensation to the Aboriginal tribes that were devastated by the nuclear tests. Neri Morgan survived the ordeal, and today he is in his 80s, still sharing this incredible and tragic story with younger generations so that the history of his people is never forgotten. Now, let's move to another afternoon, this one in the fall of 2019, in a quiet neighborhood in Knoxville, Iowa. It was around 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, October 26th, and 56-year-old Pamela Kramer was enjoying a beautiful day in her son's backyard. Pamela was a warm, family-oriented woman who worked during the week as an assistant at a nearby United States Army base. But her job was just a way to pay the bills. Her true passion in life was her family. She lived for her husband, for children, and her grandchildren. On this particular Saturday, the family had gathered in the backyard for a very special occasion. They were holding a gender reveal party for Pamela's son and his pregnant wife, who were expecting a new baby. Pamela was absolutely thrilled and could not wait to find out if she was going to have a new grandson or granddaughter. After everyone had chatted and enjoyed some food, Pamela's son announced to the guests that it was finally time for the big reveal. The guests, including Pamela and several other close relatives, got excited and backed up toward the safety of the wooden fence on the side of the yard to get a good view. Pamela pulled out her mobile phone and began recording a video. She wanted to capture every single second of this beautiful moment so she could look back on it for years to come. In the center of the yard, the family had set up a homemade device that was supposed to shoot a cloud of colored powder into the air. Blue powder would mean it was a boy, and pink would mean it was a girl. Pamela's son walked out to the middle of the lawn and leaned over the device. He turned back to the crowd, smiled, and asked if everyone was ready. Pamela gave him a big thumbs up, keeping her phone pointed directly at him. Her son then bent down and lit a fuse attached to the device. He quickly backed away, running over to stand next to his pregnant wife along the fence line with the rest of the family. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the colorful cloud to appear. But instead of a beautiful puff of colored powder, a deafening metallic explosion shattered the air. In an instant, the peaceful backyard turned into a war zone. The homemade device was not just a harmless powder launcher. The family had built the device using a thick metal cylinder which they had packed tightly with gunpowder and the colored dust, sealing the top and bottom. When the son lit the fuse, he had unknowingly created a highly volatile pipe bomb. The immense pressure of the burning gunpowder could not escape the metal pipe safely, causing the steel cylinder to rupture and violently explode. Sharp, jagged metal shrapnel was blasted in every direction at incredible speeds, flying up to 400 feet away. Some pieces of metal tore through the wooden fences of neighboring homes, while others lodged themselves into the walls of the house. Tragically, one large piece of the exploding metal flew directly toward the fence line where the family was standing. It struck Pamela directly in the head, knocking her to the ground. The backyard erupted into total chaos as family members screamed in terror and rushed to call emergency services. When the first responders arrived, they found a devastating scene. Metal debris was scattered everywhere, and Pamela was lying near the fence, having died instantly from her injuries. It was a heartbreaking tragedy that shocked the local community. Miraculously, despite the heavy shrapnel flying all over the yard and through the neighborhood, no one else was injured. Because the incident was determined to be a tragic and unintentional accident, the local authorities decided not to file any criminal charges against the family. Now, let's fast forward to another clear morning on October 30th, 2014, in Wichita, Kansas. A 54-year-old Russian pilot named Sergei Galitsky walked into the Flight Safety International building located at the Wichita National Airport. Sergei was accompanied by his personal translator. Sergei was a highly experienced pilot who had spent over 30 years flying commercial jets and helicopters back in Russia. But on this day, he was in Kansas to obtain a specific certification to fly a Cessna turboprop plane. Because he did not speak fluent English, he brought his translator along to help him communicate with the flight instructors and understand the technical training. Inside the lobby, the translator explained to the front desk clerk that Sergei was there for his scheduled training session. The clerk smiled, nodded, and went to the back of the building to locate Sergei's designated instructor. A few moments later, the clerk returned with 78-year-old Jay Ferguson. Jay was a legendary flight instructor with decades of aviation experience, known for his thoroughness and deep knowledge of aircraft. After shaking hands and greeting each other, Jay led Sergei and the translator through the security doors and deep into the state-of-the-art training facility. As they walked down the hallways, they passed several large, high-tech rooms filled with millions of dollars worth of advanced aviation equipment. Eventually, Jay stopped the group in front of a massive, white spherical pod that sat mounted on top of a complex hydraulic base. To an ordinary person, it looked like a high-tech simulator ride you might find at an amusement park. But to Sergei, he knew what this was. This was a professional-level flight simulator designed to perfectly mimic the flight dynamics, cockpit layout, and emergency scenarios of a real Cessna aircraft. Even though Sergei had thousands of hours of real flight experience, the aviation authority required him to complete several simulated flights in this exact pod to prove his competency before they would allow him to pilot a real Cessna. Jay opened the heavy door to the simulator pod and gestured for the men to climb inside. Sergei climbed in first and sat down in the captain's seat on the left. Jay took the co-pilot's seat on his right, and the translator sat directly behind them so he could whisper instructions into Sergei's ear. Looking out the windows of the pod, Sergei was amazed by how realistic the simulation was. High-definition screens projected a perfect, three-dimensional view of the actual runway at the Wichita National Airport. It felt exactly as if they were sitting on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. Together, Jay and Sergei began going through the rigorous pre-flight safety checklists, verifying the virtual instruments, testing the flight controls, and ensuring the radio communications were working perfectly. Once everything was verified, Jay pressed a control panel button to start the simulation. Instantly, the hydraulic base beneath the pod activated, and the entire cabin began to rumble and vibrate, perfectly mimicking the sound and feel of a powerful propeller engine roaring to life. Jay gave Sergei the signal to begin. Sergei released the parking brake, grabbed the control yoke, and pushed the throttles forward. The simulator tilted slightly backward, giving the men the physical sensation of accelerating down the runway. As they gained speed, Sergei pulled back on the yoke, and the digital scenery tilted down as they climbed high into the simulated sky. For the next several minutes, Sergei practiced maneuvering the aircraft through the virtual airspace, performing turns, climbs, and descents. The flight simulator's advanced hydraulics moved the pod in perfect synchronization with Sergei's inputs, making the flight feel incredibly lifelike. Jay watched closely, occasionally speaking into his headset, with the translator quickly relaying the instructions to Sergei in Russian. Sergei adjusted quickly to the Cessna's sensitive controls, and Jay was highly impressed by the Russian pilot's smooth handling of the aircraft. It was clear that Sergei was going to easily pass his certification test. After completing all the required maneuvers, Jay decided it was time to bring the session to a close and have Sergei perform a landing back at the airport. Sergei turned the simulated plane around, lined it up with the virtual runway, and began his final descent. He carefully managed his speed and altitude, bringing the plane down smoothly toward the asphalt. Everything was going perfectly. Sergei brought the nose up slightly, preparing for a soft landing. But the exact microsecond the virtual tires of the simulator touched down on the digital runway, a massive, deafening crash shattered the silence of the room, and everything instantly went black. At that very same moment, people standing outside on the tarmac and near the airport buildings heard a terrifying, thunderous explosion. They spun around and saw a thick black column of smoke and giant flames shooting out from the roof of the Flight Safety International building. Bystanders immediately called 911 as sirens began to wail across the airport. When the firefighters and emergency crews arrived on the scene, they were shocked by the scale of the destruction. Part of the building's roof and walls had been completely pulverized, and a raging fire was consuming the interior. It would turn out that while Sergey, Jay, and the translator were inside the dark simulator pod, another pilot named Mark Goldstein was taking off from the very same airport in a real twin-engine passenger plane. Shortly after takeoff, Mark's real plane suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, causing him to lose complete control of the aircraft. The plane veered wildly off course, plunged toward the ground, and crashed directly through the roof of the Flight Safety International building. By an almost impossible and tragic coincidence, the crashing plane struck the exact room and the exact simulator pod where Sergey and his team were conducting their training. The violent impact and the subsequent fuel explosion instantly killed the pilot of the real plane, Mark, as well as Jay, Sergey, and his translator inside the simulator. It was a bizarre and tragic event that sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One afternoon in November of 1980, 8-year-old John Reed sat at a small table on the veranda of a hotel in the remote Brazilian village of Barcelos. It had taken him 2 full days by boat to get there from the Amazon city of Manaus. Sitting across from him was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongola tribe, a man named Tatanka Nara. For the past 10 days, John had listened to Tatanka tell impossible stories about hidden cities deep beneath the jungle and ancient civilizations protected from the modern world. Most people would have dismissed those stories immediately. But not John. With every conversation, he found himself believing more and more. And sitting there now, staring across the table at the man he had dreamed about meeting since he was a child, John had no idea that this belief was about to completely consume his life. This place, Barcelos, and this man, Tatanka, were a world away from where John had grown up. He was from San Francisco, California, a place of suburbs and city streets. But even as a kid, he had dreamed of coming to this exact spot, of meeting this exact man. It was surreal to him that he had actually made it happen. And if things continued to go the way John hoped they would, he might never have to go back to America. Because John wasn't on a vacation. He was on a quest. He was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Acacor. Now, there was almost no historical record that this city ever actually existed. The only real mention of it was in a single book called The Chronicle of Acacor, written by a German journalist named Karl Brugger. According to Karl's book, Acacor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization. They were supposedly like the Incas or the ancient Egyptians, a massive empire with an incredibly advanced society for their time. But Karl wrote that the people of Acacor were far superior because they were descended from actual gods. The book claimed that when European colonizers came to the Amazon, the people of Acacor weren't wiped out like so many other indigenous groups. Instead, they went underground. They literally rebuilt their capital city in a network of subterranean tunnels and hid their entire civilization from the modern world. The legend even said that they were still down there, living in secret, guarding a vast treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Most credible historians and archaeologists called Karl's book complete fiction. They said the author had just made the whole thing up to sell copies and make a quick buck. But John Reed paid no attention to the skeptics. Any small doubts he might have had about the story completely evaporated the moment he finally met Tatanka Nara in person. Tatanka wasn't just some local guide. He was a famous chief who knew the Amazon jungle like the back of his hand. But more importantly, at least to John, Tatanka had been interviewed extensively for Carl's book. He was said to be the one and only known person still alive who had actually been to the lost city of Akakor. And here he was, in the flesh, sitting right across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a simple loincloth, and on his chest was the very same turtle tattoo that the book described in detail. For John, this was all the proof he needed. He was absolutely looking at the right guy, the chief he had traveled thousands of miles to find. And in John's mind, if Tatanka was real, then surely everything else in that book had to be real too. But right now, in this moment, neither John nor Tatanka were saying a word. This was unusual. Normally, their meetings were very animated. Tatanka would regale John with these incredible, vivid stories about Akakor, telling him what it was like there in his heavily accented English. But just hearing the stories wasn't enough for John anymore. He desperately wanted to know where Akakor was so that he could see it with his own eyes. So far, Tatanka had been evasive. He'd always said that the people of Akakor wanted to stay hidden, that their very survival depended on their secrecy, and that he could never give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different. A few minutes ago, John had asked him again, more directly this time, about literally going to Akakor. And since then, Tatanka had been completely silent for a very long time, as if he was deeply considering whether or not to finally reveal the city's location. So John just waited patiently. As he sat there in that thick, intense silence, it felt like he could almost feel Tatanka's deep wisdom radiating off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, fragmented English, Tatanka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on a cool evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, a 35-year-old woman named Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her home in the San Francisco area. She got out of her car to check the mail. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and a bit bleary-eyed as she reached into the mailbox and mindlessly pulled out a stack of letters and bills. But as she started sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop cold. It was a letter, postmarked from Germany. Sandy didn't know anyone who lived in Germany, so she had no idea what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the typed lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective. He said he was writing to her about her brother, John, and that the German police were sure that something very bad had happened to him. John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find that lost civilization of Akakor. And Sandy and her parents hadn't heard a single word from him since he left. During the first few weeks of John's trip, he had written letters to them fairly regularly. But then his last message had arrived in late 1980, and after that, just complete silence. Of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother. But at the same time, she hadn't been totally surprised that he had gone radio silent. Sandy and her parents were well aware of just how obsessed John was with Akakor. It wasn't just about the adventure for him. He wanted to find this lost city in the jungle and then never come home. His plan was to stay there. So, over the years, they had kind of settled on a theory. They figured that maybe he had actually found Akakor, or maybe he had just found another remote village somewhere deep in the jungle. But either way, the way they saw it, John had likely chosen to start a new life for himself, and that's probably what he had done. For nearly a decade, that was the story they told themselves. But now, as Sandy stood there reading this letter, it was like her entire understanding of what had happened to her brother was instantly and totally fractured. She was suddenly panicked, but also completely confused. The idea that John was in trouble was terrifying enough, but why were the German police looking for him? Why wasn't it American law enforcement? As her eyes frantically scanned the rest of the page, she learned why. The detective explained that they were investigating the death or disappearance of not just John, but at least 3 other people, including a German citizen. And all of these people had apparently been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. This book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor was not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was actively killing the people who came to the Amazon looking for it. The detective said they had tried to investigate further, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative. He wasn't even allowed to travel to Brazil to collect evidence or try to figure out what was happening there. So basically, he was stuck. But he wanted her to know that they were looking into her brother's case. By the time Sandy finished reading that letter, she felt like she had to do something. If the German police couldn't go to Brazil, then maybe she could. And sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into a hotel. She knew from John's last letters from almost 10 years ago that this was the general area where he had been before he disappeared. Her plan, roughly speaking, was to search the entire city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Obviously, this was a massive undertaking. Manaus is a huge, sprawling city. But at this point, Sandy was all in on this mission. She didn't really know why. For 10 years, she'd had no idea what had happened to John. But now, it was like she felt she was being called to do whatever it took to go and find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her entire savings account, and bought a one-way flight. She even brought along a small audio tape recorder so that she could document everything so she wouldn't miss a single detail. Her plan was to spend all of her time interviewing locals, recording what they said, trying to figure out if anyone knew anything about John or about Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually started doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized just how incredibly hard it was going to be. It had been nearly a decade since her brother had gone missing. When she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless, conflicting rumors with no actual evidence to back them up. On top of that, all the rumors she heard seemed to contradict each other. Some people said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then a Ninley person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, no, none of that is true. What really happened is that John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had simply decided to live with them. Even though all this information was all over the place, there was one common reaction that almost everyone Sandy spoke to had, and that was fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would clam up, like they were genuinely scared of it. They all clearly knew about the legend, but most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to just leave it alone. People told her not to talk about that, and that looking for Akakor could get her into serious trouble or even get her killed. So, as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. Each night, as she lay in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, if this whole thing was impossible. But then, it was like every night after she drifted off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And in these dreams, he would say to her that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So, just about every morning when she woke up, she would have this renewed sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, when she was basically running out of money and would have to go home soon, she heard another rumor. This one was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. By this point, Sandy had spent 3 full weeks in and around Manaus and felt completely overwhelmed. She really hadn't made any progress. There was a definite sense of fear surrounding Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that fear herself, like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether he was real or not, it actually made her more scared. She knew she should try to find him, to see if he knew where her brother was, but there was also a part of her that was just terrified of even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too big, too dangerous, and too overwhelming for her. And so, after learning about Tatanka, Sandy's reaction was to pack up her bags and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy didn't just fly back to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for him in a more roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so, after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information for her. So, by the end of all that travel, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it hadn't worked. Sandy seriously considered just going home. She was broke, she was scared, and she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatanka. She had abandoned it because it just felt too scary. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatanka was the key, and she had been a coward. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash by cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On the 21st of June, 1990, about a year after her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatanka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but she also wanted to draw attention and resources to help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time she had been back in America earning money, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos. She knew by now that Carl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that had sent John on his quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos. Tourists came from all over the world to talk to Tatanka and to try to find the lost city. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village itself. It was dirty, and the houses were all very run-down shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had a single telephone. And so, as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatanka lived. The woman immediately nodded, which Sandy had expected. Sandy now knew a lot about Tatanka. She knew that basically everyone in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who had once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero, too. One time, he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. The country's secret service was actually in his debt. And of course, Tatanka was interviewed extensively in the Chronicle of Akakor and was the only known person who had actually been to the city and knew its location. More recently, Tatanka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. So, Sandy got directions to Tatanka's hotel from the woman. And as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this man, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also deep fear. There was just something heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a high wooden gate. And inside the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was a very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatanka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards him, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, explaining why she was there. Tatanka at first just kind of listened and watched as they approached him. But then, as he began to understand what she was saying, he smiled. And in broken English, he told Sandy that he was surprised she hadn't come to see him sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile. because as she stared at Tatanka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatanka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having, where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that Akakor was not what he thought it would be, were absolutely correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by the author Carl Brugger to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatanka Nara, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting. But Tatanka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not the chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatanka was just a random German man named Günther Hack. He had fled Germany for the Amazon in the 1960s to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife. When he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language and he had a very heavy German accent. So, what did he do? He created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from. The entire story of Akakor was invented by this guy just so he wouldn't have to pay child support. The problem was, the Akakor legend worked a little too well. Günther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced the writer Carl Brugger that he really was from this lost civilization, which inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. So when Carl's book came out, Günther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and that he knew where it was, while also making sure that nobody could ever actually get there. Both Sandy and the German police believed that to protect this secret, Günther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Günther Hauk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Carl Brugger, was shot to death in 1,984 inches Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. As of 2024, Günther Hauk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and he is still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. On the night of the 14th of November, 1994, 5-6-year-old Dwight Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy, single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but Dwight was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, Dwight was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around, causing the whole rig to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so, as he was driving along, white-knuckling the steering wheel, all he could think about was how taking this route had been such a bad idea. Dwight was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans. That's why he had one hitched to the back of his truck to drive it from city to city and show it off to potential new customers. He had just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. The drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but Dwight had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a blizzard, fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a sheer cliff on one side. For just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for Dwight, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. He had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced one yet. So this was a completely new and terrifying experience, but Dwight was a very religious man. And so, as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him incredibly stressed, all he began to do was just quietly and internally pray. And for a time, this seemed to work. He was staying on the road. He was making his way up the mountain. He thought he was going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions. DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. The next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then, after what felt like an eternity where he was thinking he was about to go right off the cliff, his truck slammed hard into a snowbank, stopping him just short of the edge. After that, everything went quiet and still. For a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. That was a huge win. He had survived. Then he checked himself over, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. Also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside from hitting the snowbank, but it just seemed like he had slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and had saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get any traction. And so he realized, yes, he survived the crash, but he might not be able to move. And he was up here in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It was snowing like crazy. He had no idea what to do. It was the middle of the night. He didn't have a phone, he didn't have a radio, so he had no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck by the side of the road, so he didn't have any food or water or really any provisions. He also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time, so he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anyone went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath and said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear that it had been snowing all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It was multiple feet deep out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out. It was pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires just spun. He didn't move an inch. Now, it was daylight, so he thought maybe now he could look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give him a sense of how close he was to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every single direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was, since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. He was just in this whiteout. DeWitt was trying his best not to panic. Instead, he focused on what he had, what supplies were available to him right now. He started looking around the inside of his truck, and he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff. There were some cushions and a sheet so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be careful not to burn through too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You could just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this wasn't really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was completely unfurnished. There was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just an empty shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though he had very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like he had enough to keep him alive for a while, and in that time, he was going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped even more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So, He had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, and it had been several days, he was also warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow. So he was surviving as best as he could. And to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also by writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks. But DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger was actually a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like he should be dead. He hadn't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It had to be. On the morning of the 20th of May, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was still quite a bit of snow and the road was still quite icy. About halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck. It began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there, kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't budge. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the roadway and off to the side of the road. And there, basically equal to where he was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. The teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look just in case somebody else had had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed away. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who had kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him again. Somebody was going to show up and rescue him because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed it, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. He might have gotten out to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed inside. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen that there was actually a paved path. And due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground there. So even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside. And he could have walked it down to civilization. It would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited right here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again. He just didn't leave his truck. And then, when he began to feel that incredible ache from starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it just built that resolve inside of him. Clearly, God has a plan. Clearly, I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a monster, a killer, or even the wilderness. Sometimes it's just believing in the wrong things. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and wait for the notification to see the strange, gloomy, and mysterious things that await you. See you next time. Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So, Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground, flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered 2 innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word "let's" to the word "just." And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the 3-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. He decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. But it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were two police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-o'-lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? It was a little after 1 in the afternoon on the 18th of May, 2007, when a 7-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a large park in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She was on her way to meet a friend, and his house was located right in the middle of this park, so she had to walk through it to get there. This was a daily ritual for Yvonne. Nearly every single day, she would make this same walk to go and spend time with her friend. Usually, on a weekday afternoon, the park was pretty quiet. There might be a few people strolling along the paths, but for the most part, it was a calm and peaceful walk. But on this particular day, the park was absolutely packed with people. It was the Friday, kicking off a long holiday weekend, and the weather was beautiful and sunny. It seemed like everyone in the city had the same idea to come out and enjoy the spring air. Families were everywhere, the playground was overflowing with kids, and the park's little cafe had a line out the door. Yvonne, however, wasn't really paying much attention to the crowds around her. Her mind was focused entirely on her friend. They had known each other for years, and in her heart, she felt they shared a very special connection, the kind of bond she didn't really have with anyone else in her life. Now, Yvonne was well aware that many people, including some of her own family and friends, didn't quite see it that way. They thought the relationship was less special and more strange. Some had even told her directly that they disapproved of it, and she could understand why they might feel that way, at least on the surface. Yvonne was a very friendly, social, and outgoing person. She loved to chat and be around people. Her friend, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was extremely reclusive and almost never left his house. To an outsider, they seemed like a very odd pair. There were other things, too. Her friend was originally from Germany, and even though he had been living in the Netherlands for many years, he had never learned to speak Dutch. This meant he couldn't really communicate with anyone, and that included Yvonne, at least not with words. But for Yvonne, none of that mattered. In fact, the disapproval from others only made her feel more protective of him. She felt like people just didn't understand. She was also deeply sympathetic to his past. She knew that her friend had been abandoned by his mother when he was just a child, and this fact always tugged at her heart. In a way, she saw herself as a sort of maternal figure in his life, stepping in to offer the care and companionship he had been denied. And so, as she continued her walk, her thoughts filled with warmth for her friend, she rounded a final corner on the path. Up ahead, she could see his house. As she got closer, she could see him through one of the front windows. He didn't look happy at all. He looked downcast, almost dejected, and seeing him like that made her want to cheer him up even more. So she put on her biggest, warmest smile. She started waving enthusiastically as she approached his house, trying to catch his eye. And sure enough, after a moment, he turned his head, looked out the window, and saw her. His entire demeanor changed. He broke into a big smile and began to wave back at her. For Yvonne, this was everything. It was proof of their connection. Even without a shared language, they understood each other. Seeing his smile filled her with a pure sense of happiness. She felt so glad that she was there for him. She walked the rest of the way to his house and went to see him. That day was spent much like all their other days together. Because they couldn't talk, their time was filled with simple gestures and quiet companionship. They would just sit together, enjoying each other's presence. It was a unique relationship, but for Yvonne, it was more than enough. She truly believed he felt the same way, that he valued their time together just as much as she did. But as much as she cherished these visits, she couldn't stay all day. She had her own family and responsibilities to get back to. So, at around 2:30 inches the afternoon, after spending about an hour with him, she said her goodbyes. She turned to leave, knowing that she would be back again soon, probably the very next day. Yvonne walked away from her friend's house and had only taken a few steps down the path when two different things happened at almost the exact same time. First, she noticed a group of young kids off to the side, and they were throwing rocks. It was just a small detail, but her mind registered it. It was the kind of thing that you see and instinctively know shouldn't be happening in a public park. She didn't think much more of it, but she was aware of it. The second thing she noticed was a sound. It was the sound of splashing coming from somewhere behind her. This seemed odd. It hadn't rained recently, so there were no puddles on the path. The only source of water nearby was a small stream that ran through the park, but it was in an area that was off-limits to visitors. There was no reason anyone should be in there. But the splashing sound was unmistakable. Yvonne wasn't alarmed by any of this, just curious. Her mind was simply processing these little details from her surroundings. And so, she found herself turning around, mostly to see what could possibly be making that splashing noise. As she turned, something enormous and powerful slammed into her. It hit her with such force that she was knocked to the ground and pinned there. All around her, the park erupted in screams. The last conscious thought that flashed through her mind before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not too far away, a man named Arved Hendris was also at the park with his wife and their two young children. They were standing right outside that little cafe that Yvonne had been walking near. Arved had just been about to go inside to buy some drinks when the commotion started. He heard the same screams that had filled Yvonne's final moments of consciousness. The cafe was a small place, really more of a glorified snack bar than a restaurant. It sat on a main pathway that cut through the park and had a large pavilion out front with tables and chairs. From where Arved was standing on that pavilion, he could hear the screaming getting louder, and then he saw people. Dozens of people were running directly towards him. But Arved had absolutely no idea what was happening. He couldn't see what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It was just pure sudden panic. Instinct took over. Before he even knew what the threat was, his first thought was to protect his family. He grabbed his kids and his wife and ran into the cafe along with the rest of the terrified crowd. The inside of the cafe felt a bit like a small dining hall, with large communal tables filling the space. It wasn't built to hold this many people at once. As everyone rushed inside, the room quickly descended into chaos. A few people had the presence of mind to try and barricade the entrance. The front door brothers were made of glass and wouldn't offer much protection, but they did their best, shoving tables and chairs against them to block whatever was outside. After this initial rush, a strange and tense calm fell over the room. The air was still buzzing with fear, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Arved, like most of the other people crammed inside, was still completely in the dark. They had all just reacted to the panic of the crowd, assuming there must have been a very real danger outside. Now, in this weird lull, everyone was looking around at each other, wondering what was going on. Were they safe now? Or had they overreacted? As they all stood there in suspense, the glass of the front doors suddenly shattered. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through the cafe. The room was plunged back into absolute chaos. Parents were grabbing their children, screaming, and now everyone was trying to get out. The place that had seemed like a safe shelter moments before now felt like a trap. A huge bottleneck formed at the shattered doors as dozens of people tried to squeeze through at once. It was just a frantic crush of bodies. Arved looked at the mob of people and knew there was no way he could get his family through that safely. So he made a different choice. He grabbed his wife and his kids, and he pulled them under one of the large, heavy tables to hide. For the next couple of minutes, the sounds of madness continued all around them. People were screaming, crying, and scrambling to get out of the cafe. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it all went quiet. Everyone else had made it out. It was just Arved and his family huddled together under the table, listening to the silence. For a brief moment, Arved felt a sense of relief. He thought, whatever it was, it's over. We're safe. But just before he told his family it was okay to come out, he heard another sound. It was the sound of more glass breaking. And then he heard loud, heavy, stomping sounds. Something huge was making its way through the broken front doors and into the cafe. Arved peered out from under the table, and in that moment, when he saw what had entered the cafe, he finally understood why everyone had been running. He also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out that all the people in Yvonne's life who had frowned upon her special friendship had been right to be concerned. Because although Yvonne loved her friend and their daily routine, her friend did not feel the same way at all. Every day, when Yvonne would visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company, and she would smile at him. And in her mind, when her friend smiled back, it was a sign of their mutual affection. It was the foundation of their bond. What Yvonne never knew was that her friend absolutely hated it. For him, her smile was not a friendly gesture. On that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park surrounding his home was far more crowded and noisy than usual. And those kids that Yvonne had briefly noticed, the ones throwing rocks, they had been doing it for a while. Some of those rocks had been hitting his house, and the repeated thuds were making him more and more agitated. And then, through all of this, Yvonne had been there, smiling at him over and over again. She thought she was being comforting, but her actions were just adding fuel to the fire. Her constant smiling sent him right over the edge. So, when Yvonne finally got up and walked away, you might think her friend would have felt a sense of relief. One of the sources of his agitation was finally gone. But he knew she wasn't leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow and the day after that, like she always did, with that same infuriating smile. He just couldn't take it anymore. So, he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limit stream to get across the park to where Yvonne was walking away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at her before she could smile at him. And for the very first time, she didn't smile back. Instead, her face was filled with terror. And that was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Bokedo. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, baring your teeth in what humans call a smile is not a sign of friendship. It is a sign of aggression, a threat, a display of hostility. So, from Bokedo's point of view, it's very likely that for years, almost every single day, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure to threaten him. And when he smiled back, showing his own teeth, he was threatening her right back, hoping she would finally get the message and leave him alone. But it never worked. She always came back. Eventually, it all just became too much for him to handle. Luckily, despite the rampage, Bokedo didn't seriously harm anyone else. He bit Yvonne over 100 times and broke multiple of her bones, but somehow she did survive the attack. No other zoo guests were injured, including Arvevd and his family. They were trapped in that cafe while Bokedo walked around inside, but for whatever reason, the gorilla never attacked them. After some time, Arved and his family were able to make a run for it and get to safety. After she had recovered from her injuries, Yvonne spoke to the media. She told them that Bokedo was still her darling. That's the word she used. And incredibly, she would eventually go back to the zoo to see him again. But this time, she didn't smile. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th of August, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ally Dogan was sitting in the very front seat of a passenger bus as it traveled down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ally and the 50 or so other passengers were making the journey from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, the largest city in the country. They were about 3 hours into what was supposed to be a 5-hour trip. To pass the time, Ally had been talking quietly with the man sitting next to him. The man was a lieutenant in the Air Force. The lieutenant told Ally that he wasn't even supposed to be on this bus. Originally, he had a plane ticket to fly to Istanbul, but he had missed his flight. And so, here he was. But the lieutenant wasn't upset about it. He told Ally that he was actually really enjoying the bus ride. He had never been on a long-distance bus trip before, and he thought it was a neat experience. Most importantly, he had managed to get a seat in the very front row, right behind the huge front window of the bus. He said he found it exhilarating to be able to see the road rushing towards them in the dark. Ally felt the exact same way. In fact, when he had first boarded the bus, someone else had been sitting in his seat next to the lieutenant. Ally had specifically asked that passenger if they would be willing to switch spots with him because he wanted that incredible view too. So he and the lieutenant had quickly bonded over their shared excitement for their front row seats. They spoke in hushed voices because nearly everyone else on the bus was fast asleep around them. But these two were wide awake, wired with the simple thrill of watching the road unfold before them. But after a while, despite his enthusiasm, Ali started to feel drowsy. He was on his way back to Istanbul for college, and later that day, he had a very important exam. As much as he wanted to stay up all night and enjoy the ride, he knew he really needed to get some sleep if he was going to do well on his test. So he took off his sweatshirt, rolled it up into a makeshift pillow, and placed it behind his head. He told the lieutenant he was going to try and get some rest, then he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. About 15 minutes passed, and Ally was just beginning to drift into a real sleep, when the bus was suddenly filled with the sound of screams. Ally's eyes snapped open. He looked straight ahead out the front windshield and saw a pair of bright headlights barreling down on them. They were in the wrong lane, or another vehicle was in their lane. It didn't matter. He knew in that instant that they were about to have a head-on collision. Then, the bus driver wrenched the wheel, and the bus swerved hard to the right. Ally grabbed onto the partition in front of him to keep from being thrown out of his seat. He braced himself for the impact he knew was coming. But at the very last second, instead of smashing into the other vehicle, the bus veered completely off the road. It went crashing down into a deep ditch that ran alongside the road. The bus lurched violently before the driver managed to slam on the brakes and bring it to a stop. For a second, there was silence. Ally looked around. Everyone was shaken up, but it seemed they were okay. He felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. They had avoided what would have been a catastrophic crash. But that feeling of relief didn't last long. Ally quickly realized they had a new and very serious problem. The bus was starting to fill with thick smoke. Because they were sitting at the very front, Ally and the lieutenant were the closest to the main door. It was clear that they needed to evacuate immediately. It looked like the crash had started some kind of fire. The two men stood up. The bus was tilted at a strange angle from where it had landed in the ditch. They made their way to the front and looked out through the now cracked front windshield. Out in the darkness, they could see a huge truck that was also in the ditch just ahead of them. That must have been the vehicle they had nearly hit. It seemed they had collided with it after all, just not head-on. It was a dangerous situation. There was clearly a fire somewhere, and they had to get everyone off the bus as fast as possible. Ally and the lieutenant got to the door and tried to open it, but the frame of the bus had been warped in the crash, and the door was jammed shut. The lieutenant got down and started smashing his body against the door, trying to force it open. As he did this, the smoke inside the bus was getting thicker and darker. The other passengers were starting to panic. They were all rushing towards the front, crowding around Ally and the lieutenant, desperate to get out. Finally, with a loud groan of metal, the lieutenant managed to force the door open. The second it opened, an even bigger plume of black smoke poured into the bus from outside. You could barely see a thing. Everyone was choking and screaming. The lieutenant just yelled at Ally to get out right now. And so Ally was the first person off the bus. He scrambled down the steps into a wall of smoke. He had no idea where the fire was actually coming from. It was just smoke everywhere. Acting on pure instinct, he just jumped. He leaped as high and as far away from the bus as he possibly could. He landed on the far side of the ditch. He stumbled but managed to climb up the other side of the embankment, putting distance between himself and the bus. As soon as he was clear, he turned around and looked back. It was the middle of the night, but even in the darkness, he could see the bus was completely swallowed by that thick, dark smoke. He still couldn't see any flames, but he figured the engine must have caught fire and it was spreading underneath the bus. He could hear the people still on board, desperately trying to get out through the single door that the lieutenant had opened. But there seemed to be a bottleneck. They weren't getting out fast enough. People were screaming in panic, and then Ally heard the sound of windows being pushed open. People were so desperate that they were starting to jump out of the windows to escape. At first, the screams Ally heard sounded like fear, the desperate cries of people trying to evacuate a burning vehicle. But very quickly, as more people started coming out of the bus, the sound of their screams changed. They turned into screams of pure, unimaginable agony. As Ally listened to this horror unfold, he tried to make sense of it. He thought, okay, maybe they're catching on fire as they jump out. Or maybe they're breaking bones when they land in the ditch. It was all terrible, but at least they were getting out of the bus. He was sure that any second they would climb up the other side of the ditch and join him where he stood. He saw them coming out. He heard them, but no one came. The screams of agony just got louder and louder, and nobody climbed out of that ditch. Ally was still all alone, and he had no idea why. All he could see was smoke, and all he could hear were those terrible screams. Then, authorities began to arrive at the scene. He watched as they rushed into the smoke, trying to fight whatever fire was there and rescue the people trapped inside. But despite this huge emergency response happening right in front of him, nobody, not even the lieutenant who had saved him, ever came over the ditch to where he was. He was completely alone. After some time, Ally noticed a few of the emergency workers walking away from the bus, away from the smoke. They were carrying what looked like bodies. But as he stared, a cold dread filled him. They weren't carrying whole bodies. They were carrying body parts. It would turn out that many of the initial assumptions were correct. The bus had swerved to avoid an oncoming vehicle. It had struck the big truck that Allie and the lieutenant saw in the ditch. It wasn't a head-on impact, but more of a glancing blow. That collision was enough to send both vehicles off the road and into the ditch. And the crash is what caused all the smoke. But everyone, including Allie, had been completely wrong about what was causing that smoke. There was no fire at all. The truck that the bus had hit was a shipping truck. It was transporting a huge cargo of freight to Istanbul. When the two vehicles collided, the truck's shipping containers were ruptured and the entire contents of those containers poured out into the ditch. The ditch, where the bus had crashed, already had a significant amount of standing water in it from recent rains. When the freight from the truck mixed with the water, it triggered a powerful chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is what produced the thick, choking clouds of smoke. The freight being transported in that truck was nitric acid. It's a highly corrosive and extremely toxic liquid chemical. Now, that entire ditch, which was filled with water, had become a massive smoking acid bath. And so all of those desperate passengers, thinking they were escaping a fire, were leaping out of the bus and landing directly in the ditch. They were landing in a pool of diluted but still incredibly powerful acid, and they were being dissolved by it. Allie had survived for one simple reason. When he was the first one to get off the bus, he thought he was jumping away from a fire at the base of the vehicle. So he took a huge leap, trying to clear the flames he imagined were there. In doing so, without realizing it, he had jumped completely over the acid bath and landed safely on the other side. But virtually everyone who came after him went straight into the acid. In the end, of the nearly 50 people who had been on that bus, 26 of them dissolved to death in that ditch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.